June 9, 1944, 09:15 hours, 15,000 feet over the Baie de la Seine, occupied France. The cockpit of the Messerschmitt May 410 Ornice was a vibrating, frigid bubble of plexiglass. Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner, his oxygen mask clamped tight, fought the controls, his hands aching from the 30°C cold. He was a 26-year-old veteran of Aufklärungsgruppe 123, a long-range reconnaissance group. His job was not to fight but to see. His mission, a high-speed, high-altitude dash over the Allied invasion coast. He was to photograph the beachhead, count the ships, and confirm what the Wehrmacht High Command already believed, that this Normandy landing was a large-scale diversion, a feint, and that the real invasion, Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group, was still poised to strike at Calais. In the breast pocket of his flight suit, a letter from his brother, an engineer with the organization taught building the Atlantic Wall, contained a single confident line: "Let them come. They must take a port, and the ports are fortresses. They will bleed to death on the concrete." Klaus shared this confidence. War was about logistics. An army of this size needed a harbor, Cherbourg or Le Havre, and both were impregnable. These Normandy beaches, they were a temporary doomed beachhead. He had survived the gauntlet. The sky was swarming with P-51s and Spitfires, the Allied buzzards, and the channel was a solid mass of flak ships. But he was through. He leveled off over the sector codenamed Gold by the enemy, near the small town of Arromanches, and switched on his high-speed RB-5030 cameras. He banked, looking down, and his blood froze. He looked again, his mind rejecting the information his eyes were providing. It was impossible. Below him, it was not a beachhead. It was a city of concrete and steel, rising from the sea. He saw massive apartment block-sized concrete blocks, arranged in a perfect 2-mile-long crescent. He saw piers stretching from the open sea over a mile to the shore. He saw trucks, tiny specks, driving in a continuous two-way line on the water. It was not a temporary pontoon. It was a deep-water harbor, a complete, functioning, impossible harbor. He checked his oxygen, his instruments, his sanity. This thing was not in any intelligence briefing. It was a geometric industrial monster that simply should not exist. His cameras whirring, Klaus Steiner realized his brother was wrong. His commanders were wrong. The Allies had not taken a port. They had brought one. The image that Oberleutnant Steiner's camera captured was the solution to the single most complex, strategic problem of the Second World War. For the SHAEF planners under General Eisenhower, Operation Overlord was a logistical nightmare. The plan called for landing 39 divisions, over 1.5 million men, with 3 million tons of supplies and 450,000 vehicles, onto a hostile shore in the first 100 days. A modern mechanized army does not just march. It is a ravenous industrial entity, consuming a river of oil and steel. The U.S. First Army alone estimated it would need 12,000 tons of supplies per day to remain combat effective. There was only one way to deliver this volume, a deep-water port. But the major ports of northern France, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, were the most heavily fortified locations on the planet. The Germans, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had turned them into Festungen, or fortresses, packed with concrete, artillery, and elite troops, all under orders to fight to the last man and demolish every facility upon attack. The Allies knew this was a trap. They had learned the lesson in the most brutal way possible. The August 1942 Dieppe raid, a frontal assault on a fortified port, had been a catastrophic, bloody disaster. Of the 6,000 men who went in, mostly Canadians, nearly 4,000 were killed, wounded, or captured in just 9 hours. Dieppe proved in blood that the Festungen could not be taken quickly or intact. This was the great, unsolvable conundrum of D-Day. The Allies needed a port to land their army, but they needed their army to capture a port. It was a perfect strategic catch-22. The solution, championed by Winston Churchill himself, was so audacious it bordered on madness. At the Quebec Conference in 1943, he declared, "If we cannot capture a port, we must bring one with us." The concept was given a code name, Mulberry. It would be the most ambitious feat of military engineering in human history. The plan, to design, build, and transport 2 massive prefabricated, artificial harbors and assemble them off the coast of Normandy in the days following the invasion. For sapper Tom Jennings, a 24-year-old Royal Engineer from Liverpool, the war had been a confusing mix of mud, concrete, and baffling secrecy. He was not a combat soldier. He was a construction worker in a uniform. For the last 9 months, he and 200,000 other men had been working 24/7 at secret sites across Britain, from the Thames estuary to the shipyards of Glasgow. His war was building things, bizarre, colossal concrete things. His project was codenamed Phoenix. He was helping build a hollow, concrete box, a caisson, the size of a 6-story apartment building, 200 feet long and weighing 6,000 tons. He had no idea what it was for. The compartmentalization of the project was total. The foreman, when asked, would just growl, "Loose lips sink ships." The rumors were wild. They were coastal defense blocks. They were anti-submarine forts. They were part of a secret invasion of Norway. No one guessed the truth. The Mulberry was a kit of parts, a gargantuan, seagoing Lego-set phoenixes, 146 of these giant concrete caissons, which would be towed across the channel and sunk by opening seacocks, forming the main breakwater, gooseberries, a line of 60 block ships, old, obsolete Allied warships and merchant vessels, to be sailed across and scuttled to create the initial, sheltered water. Whales. Over 10 miles of floating, flexible steel roadways that would form the piers, or jetties. Beetles, the concrete and steel floats that held up the whales, designed to rise and fall with the 20-foot Normandy tides. Pierheads, the spuds, massive, floating docks with 4 legs that could be jacked down to the seabed, allowing them to remain stable while the pierheads rose and fell with the waves. In late May 1944, Sapper Jennings was given his new orders. He and a small crew were assigned to their Phoenix. They were given naval training. They were no longer just engineers. They were concrete admirals. Their job was to ride this 6,000-ton concrete monster, towed by a single straining tugboat, across 100 miles of the most dangerous, war-torn sea in the world, and then, under enemy shell fire, deliberately sink it with perfect yards-apart precision. He thought of his wife, of his pub in Liverpool, and he looked at the gray, towering wall of concrete he was supposed to sail to France. It was, he thought, the maddest thing a man had ever been asked to do. The entire German defensive strategy for France was built on a single, unshakable, and fatally logical assumption. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, now in command of Army Group B, was a master of logistics. He knew what a modern army required, and he knew that the Normandy coastline, with its shallow beaches and violent gales, could never sustain a major invasion force. It was a logistical impossibility. Therefore, the invasion must come at the Pas de Calais. It was the shortest route. It was the only area with the deep-water ports of Calais, Dunkirk, and Boulogne. This was not a guess. It was a military certainty. Based on this certainty, Rommel poured all of his resources into the Pas de Calais. He massed the 15th Army there. He built the most formidable concrete and steel defenses of the entire Atlantic Wall. The Allied deception plan, Operation Fortitude, masterfully confirmed this bias. The existence of General Patton's fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, with its inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic, convinced the German High Command that Calais was, indeed, the Schwerpunkt, main point of effort. When the Normandy landings began on June 6th, the German High Command, from Oberleutnant Steiner's air group to Hitler's Wolf's Lair, saw it as the Täuschung, the diversion. A large-scale raid, perhaps, designed to draw Rommel's panzers away from Calais before the real invasion. Rommel's strategy was simple: contain the Normandy beachhead. Let it wither on the vine. Without a port, the Allies would be unable to land heavy supplies, reinforcements, or fuel. They would be pinned down, and in a few weeks, when the weather turned, they would be starved out. The entire Atlantic Wall was a strategy based on the absolute certainty that the Allies had to capture a port. The concept that they would build one was not just considered and dismissed. It simply never entered the German mind. It was a failure of imagination that would cost them the war. On June 6, 1944, while the infantry was dying on Omaha and the paratroopers were fighting in Sainte-Mère-Église, the action for the Mulberry Harbors had already begun. It was a race against the clock, a construction project in the middle of a war zone. Phase 1, D-Day, June 6th, the Gooseberries. As the assault waves hit the beaches, the first elements of the plan were put in motion. A sad-looking fleet of 60 obsolete vessels, old battleships like the HMS Centurion and merchant freighters, were sailed under their own power to the 5 invasion beaches. They were not there to fight. They were there to die. Their crews, under German artillery fire, steered them into their pre-designated positions and scuttled them, opening the seacocks. By the evening of D-Day, these sunken block ships had formed the first, crucial breakwater, a 5-mile arc that began to calm the violent surf. Phase 2, D+1, June 7th. The Great Tow, the main event began. From the Thames estuary and the harbors of southern England, the world's most bizarre armada set sail. 150 tugboats, straining at their limits, began the 100-mile 3-knot journey, towing the 146 Phoenix caissons, the Whales, and the Beetles. This was the procession that Oberleutnant Steiner would spot 2 days later. It was slow, vulnerable, and a priority target for the Kriegsmarine's E-boats and the Luftwaffe. Phase 3, D+2 to D+10, June 8-16th, the Assembly. This was Sapper Tom Jennings' moment. His tugboat, its captain a 60-year-old civilian, had successfully navigated the mine-filled channel. He was now off Arromanches. His Phoenix was maneuvered into a precise surveyed position. The command was given. Jennings and his crew scrambled into the hollow concrete chambers and opened the valves. With a groaning, shuddering roar, the 6,000-ton block settled onto the seabed, water pouring from its upper vents. A section of the wall was born. For 10 days this continued 24 hours a day, under constant German shell fire from the shore battery at Longues-sur-Mer. The Royal Engineers and U.S. Navy Seabees worked with a frantic, sleepless energy. They were not just soldiers. They were construction crews, riveters and divers connecting the Whales to the Beetles, linking the pierheads to the Phoenixes. And by D+11 the impossible was complete. Mulberry A, American at Omaha, and Mulberry B, British, at T. Arromanches were open for business. The photos from Oberleutnant Steiner's Me-410 landed on the desk of Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt at the Wehrmacht headquarters in France. The reaction was one of stunned, systemic disbelief. The German Engineering Corps examined the photos. It was not a ruse. It was not flotsam. It was a fully functional deep-water port, built in a place where God and nature had decreed no port should be. The strategic premise of Rommel's entire defense, containment and starvation, was now shattered. The Normandy beachhead was not withering. It was gorging. The impossible outcome was the sheer, breathtaking volume of supply. The river of steel was now flowing. By June 18th, the 2 Mulberry Harbors had landed over 500,000 men, over 80,000 vehicles, tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery, over 600,000 tons of supplies. Trucks were now driving directly from the decks of LST's landing ship, tank moored at the pierheads driving down the floating Whale roadways, and directly onto the beaches of France, completely bypassing the surf. The Allied buildup, which the Germans had calculated would take months, was happening in days. The Wehrmacht in Normandy, already outnumbered, was now facing an enemy that was being reinforced and resupplied faster than they could possibly comprehend. The impossible harbor had become the decisive weapon of the campaign, and it had been assembled before the Germans even understood what it was. The confirmation that the Mulberries were real, and that their capacity was almost limitless, sent a wave of profound psychological shock through the German high command. Hitler, when shown the reconnaissance photos, reportedly flew into a rage, demanding to know how this feat of engineering was possible and why his own engineers, the builders of the Atlantic Wall, had not been able to stop it, or even conceive of it. For the German soldier in the bocage, the man in the Panzerfaust ditch fighting the 21st Panzer Division, the effect was more visceral. He was being told by his commanders to hold the line, that the Tommies and Ammies would soon run out of shells. But he could see the result. He saw the endless columns of brand-new Sherman tanks, fresh from the factory, driving inland. He was subjected to 24-hour-a-day carpet bombing by artillery that had a seemingly infinite supply of ammunition. The harbor was a physical, 10-mile-long symbol of his enemy's bottomless industrial might. It was a sign that this was not a war of will or spirit. The two things his propaganda told him were superior. This was a war of production, a war of engineering, and he had lost. The Wehrmacht tried desperately to destroy the Mulberries. They sent in Magyar one-man torpedoes, Linsen explosive motorboats, and high-altitude bombers. But the harbor was too big, too redundant, and too well defended. The shock turned to a cold, hopeless despair. The Atlantic Wall had been a multi-billion Reichsmark exercise in futility. The Allies hadn't broken down the front door. They had simply built their own, bigger, in the backyard. The ultimate test of the Mulberries came not from the Germans, but from the heavens. On June 19, D+13, the worst storm in the English Channel in 40 years descended on the coast. For 3 days, 30-foot waves and 80-mph gales battered the two impossible harbors. It was a catastrophe. The American Mulberry A, located on the exposed shallow shore of Omaha Beach, was completely, utterly destroyed. The storm ripped its phoenixes apart, smashed its whales, and reduced the entire $2 billion project to a pile of wreckage. It was a total loss, but the British Mulberry B at Arromanches, in its more sheltered, deeper bay, was battered, but it held. Sapper Tom Jennings and his Royal Engineer comrades in the teeth of the gale worked as Seabees and engineers, performing heroic suicidal repairs. When the storm cleared on June 22nd, Port Winston, as it was nicknamed, was battered, but it was open. This was the decisive moment of the campaign. The Allies' main plan, the capture of the port of Cherbourg, was delayed. When it finally fell on June 27th, the Germans had so completely demolished its facilities that it was unusable for months. For the entire critical build-up to Operation Cobra and the breakout from Normandy, Arromanches was the only deep-water port the Allies possessed. In its 10-month lifespan, Mulberry B landed over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. It was, without question, the single most important piece of engineering in the entire war. The impossible harbor that Oberleutnant Steiner couldn't believe, the concrete city that Sapper Jennings helped build, was the logistical miracle that made the liberation of Europe possible.